Let's start taking a look at tourism, the symbolism of tourism. It seems like, especially here in Hawaii, it's an easy way to look at symbolism if you actually wrap it around this idea of tourism. When you're looking at tourism in general, this has become a huge area in anthropology. Tons of folks do work in tourism. And as we'll get into it, it should be pretty obvious why this is such a fertile ground for anthropologists, especially folks who want to make some money, make a name, whatever it might be. Tourism is a fascinating industry. Probably the hardest thing for people to really understand, especially here, because it's been such a critical part of our world since, basically the imagery starts in the 1860s, 1870s, and then tourism and money making starts in the early 20th century. By the 1970s, it was already the major economic revenue engine here in the Hawaiian Islands, as it was in many places, especially in Europe in that period. So for basically the last 40 or 50 years, tourism has basically paid the bills here in Hawaii, with the exception of federal money from the Department of Defense. It's the other big industry. But it's really sort of creepy, and one of the areas that doesn't really get discussed enough, and it's probably why you don't see a lot of economists and stuff dealing with tourism, is tourism didn't exist until the 1830s, and modern tourism didn't exist until basically the mid 19th century, the mid 1850s, 1870s, 1880s. And even then, it's not the term of the form of what we think of tourism as basically post-World War II, and essentially the 1950s. So it's been around for 70 years. What's really surreal about all this is here you've got something that never existed till about 150 years ago. Well, yeah, let's just say 150 years. It is now the second largest generator of money globally, outside of the militaries that the world consists of, which is the biggest spender of money, is on military. The second biggest spender is tourism, not education, not food, not healthcare, none of that stuff, tourism. And you can see this with what's happened globally with the COVID impact on tourism. Countries, including major, places like Japan, have just come to an absolute screeching halt without tourism. And yet that wouldn't have been the case even 60 to 80 years ago. Tourism would have impacted countries, but it wouldn't have just slammed them. Here in Hawaii till the 1950s, tourism would not have, suddenly stopping tourism wouldn't have had a huge impact on the economy, and the jobless rate would probably just barely moved at all. So what you have is this thing that never existed till, for our purposes, 150 years ago, that has now basically become the largest private sector industry on the planet. It's estimated that a majority of the world's countries depend on tourism to pay their bills. And in a huge part of the world, a large part of the population is involved in one way, shape, or form, directly or indirectly, with the tourism industry. That's how they pay their bills. Look at here in Hawaii. So tourism is this absolutely massive thing. This really popped out of nowhere. It's not under the control of one group. It's not based on economic need or any of the practicalities of what we normally think of as economics, like you looked at before, which is I've got something you want, you've got something you want to trade for me, and we do a deal. Tourism doesn't seem to fit any of those, which makes it an absolute nightmare for economists and other folks, because tourism basically becomes impossible to predict. We don't really understand, weirdly enough, this is something that people do. We do collectively, globally, and yet we understand very little about tourism. We understand the mechanisms of it, but we don't understand why it works the way it does. And this says something about our failures in terms of studying people, that we don't have a better grasp on the motivator logics behind tourism so that you can make predictions. You have to remember, if you understand something, one of the ways that you manifest or show, display that you understand is be able to make accurate predictions for things that haven't happened yet. What will be shows that you can do that if you understand something. If you do this, that should happen. On the boat that I have, if you sit there and drill a hole in the bottom, the boger's going to sink. If you do this, that's going to happen. It doesn't take rocket science, but that's because you understand it. Tourism, we don't really understand. And yet it's weird because it's entirely a human agency thing. And that makes it absolutely fascinating, probably almost addictive to anthropologists, because it's collective. It's based entirely on symbols. It's based on arbitrary symbols. It's based on external symbols. In other words, the stereotypes of the user, i.e. the tourist, not the folks that are being touristed upon. It's just a fascinating thing and yet despite all the studies that I've seen on tourism, I've never actually seen a really coherent discussion of tourism that actually is compelling in the sense that it actually makes these predictive models. for what it's worth, since you guys have already seen Second Life, for example, in Pleasantville, the reason I actually got originally involved in Second Life years ago was simply the fact that all of a sudden there was this little short sort of, post that someone had put on their blog pointing out that there were travel agencies in Second Life. And then just the idea that you could have travel agencies in a virtual world, but you needed travel agencies. I just couldn't visualize how the hell that worked. And that's why I first looked at Second Life, was this sort of intriguing idea that you could be a tourist in a virtual world, which struck me as being weird on so many different levels. But well, anyways, it sort of makes sense if you actually think about it in a weird way. In fact, that Berlin thing, I think you guys looked at would be a good example. So when you look at tourism, first thing we have to do is you have to figure out what it is. And tourism's definitions are pretty straightforward. That's the first two panels here. But what's really sort of surreal about them is if you understand the implications of those definitions. So it's not the words, it's what the words mean, which drives a lot of stuff, right? So the first would be is tourism. These define tourism. It doesn't matter whether it's a tourist coming here, if it's a tourist going to Jamaica, if it's a tourist going to gamble from here to going to Vegas to gamble. Doesn't make any difference. If it's tourism, it fits these criteria. So the criteria are not culturally defined. And the criteria are the mechanism of what is tourism. The first one, this is probably the most surreal one. This is one of the huge impacts that's going to be the spill out of COVID, is the fact that tourism is based on what people perceive as their discretionary income. Now, I asked the geography class who's sort of going through this right now too, what was discretionary? And I got a bunch of sort of blank looks on that one. Discretionary is a word we hear. We don't usually hear as much in American English as you do in English. But discretionary means very simply, it's something that you have a choice in. It's your choice. It's discretionary, okay? Now, if you're talking about discretionary income, that means if, for example, I make X amount of money, the discretionary money would be the money that I feel, in other words, in my head, that I feel emotionally and cognitively, that I have left after I paid all the bills and other stuff I have to pay. Okay? Whatever money is left after the have-tos would be discretionary money. Now, tourism is only based on discretionary money. Tourism is not based on money that you would use otherwise to like pay rent, pay part of your credit card or whatever it is. I mean, tourists sometimes do that when they do tourism, but that's not tourism. Tourism is defined as the use of discretionary money. Now, what's weird about that when you think about it, especially because this is the world's largest private sector global industry, is what that also is. Discretionary income is also something like buying a new pair of shoes. It's buying different, clothes. It's like getting your hair cut or getting your nails done. Going and buying a brand new, big TV from Costco. Going out to a good dinner. All that is discretionary income for most folks. And what that means is if you're a tourist destination, whether it be Hawaii or Mazatlan or Jamaica or something like that, you're competing not only with every other tourist destination for that discretionary money, but you're also competing with everything else that person could buy with that discretionary money. So the fact that tourism has become such an enormous industry is really sort of weird on a bunch of levels when you think about it, because that's people's, if you want to think, it's their funny money. And they're choosing to use it as a tourist instead of all the other things they could have done. Buy a new car, get their car repainted. I mean, I don't know, but whatever it would be that they could do, they decide to do tourist stuff instead. That is, that's not that bizarre in itself till you realize the size of the bugger. It just makes it absolutely sort of mind-blowing. That tourism becomes so compelling that you'll postpone all these other things that you could do so that you can do this instead. That's first. Secondly, is tourism is always defined as a temporary phenomenon. You're only a tourist when you go somewhere and stay there for a short period of time. So there's always a bracket. There's a time you went to someplace, and there's a time you leave that someplace. So tourism is something that has a start and a finish to it. So for example, if one of you guys moves to Japan, and you're staying there and you're going to live there, you're not going to be a tourist. I don't care if you've never been to Japan before. You might initially act like a tourist, but you don't have a finite end. You don't have an end to it. So it's not tourism. Tourism is what we call bracketed time. Third, tourism is by definition escaping your normal world. And that'd be another reason why moving to Japan might not work, because you might be actually getting a job there. So tourism is by definition leaving the world you normally live in and moving into this temporary thing, which is sort of play acting. So if you think this is why Disney is such a successful commodity. You know, you go to a Hong Kong Disneyland, the Shanghai one, you go to the LA one, or the one in Orlando, and what you're doing is you're going to someplace for a short period of time. You escape your regular world, and then Disney, in a very superb way, has sculpted that thing over the last 70 or whatever years into this very superbly designed thing to do exactly that. Of course, also take a large chunk of money from you. That's one of these discretionary income options. So escaping the normal, mundane, everyday life that we live in is the big motivator for tourism. And at some point, that's actually the major reason that it's now the world's second largest money generator, which says something about how much we aren't thrilled with the world we live in, that we're constantly willing to spend a lot of money to escape it for short little periods of time. Fourth, and this is a little bit tricky till you think about it, again, Waikiki is a perfect example of this, is tourism is weird because tourists, in fact, you can see this with the lack of mask wearing among tourists right now here in Honolulu. It makes perfect sense if you understand these definitions. Tourism is always based in the familiar, in the sense that if you're a tourist, you're spending money to go someplace. In the process of going someplace, if it's an escape, you don't have to learn new things. You're escaping the normal to relax and to otherwise enjoy yourself, to have a vicarious fantasy. And in fantasies, you don't take classes like Anthro 200. In fantasies, you don't have to do anything. You've paid for the experience, and the experience is supposed to reflect what you paid for. So you don't have to act like you would in normal life, and you don't have to learn stuff or behave like you would in normal life. The classic t-shirt that people love to wear here, which is, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. That could be, you can have, in fact, I think I've seen t-shirts on what happens in Waikiki staying, something that's silly like that. That's actually very typical of tourism. Tourism is, on one hand, has to be the familiar, because tourists aren't going to think about doing other things in the sense of behaving differently, acting differently, using different meeting rituals or something like that. They're not going to do it. They're paying to escape the world they normally exist in, and that means the line of lowest common effort, which is that I don't have to know how to do anything. I paid for this, and you guys should do what I want you to do because I'm the tourist. Now, on the other hand, it's got to be different than home. If that's why the hotels always fail here when they try to convince folks here on Oahu to go stay a couple of nights down at the hotels in Waikiki. It's sort of like, well, why? That's not a tourist experience. I mean, I already live here. Why would I spend my money on that? And so in that situation, it has to be exotic. So tourism is by definition going to some place that's different or exotic. But at the same time, you don't have to know anything. So you don't want to go someplace where you have to learn another language. If Americans go to Mexico and they go to Mazatlan, they expect to be able to speak English and have people understand them. They're not going to learn Spanish just to go to Mazatlan. If they go to Paris and France, they don't expect to speak French. They expect to speak English and people will understand them. So if you're a tourist, you don't have to spend any effort on stuff. The effort that you spent was the money that you put into the tourist experience. And that's why, to no one's surprise, tourists are not going to wear masks in Waikiki. Of course they're not going to. If they might wear masks at home, but if they're on vacation, they paid to go to vacation in Hawaii, and Hawaii's their version of sort of a paradise or something like that, then why the hell would they wear a mask? It's not part of what they're supposed to do. And if someone says you should wear a mask, they're going to tell you, up yours, I'm on vacation. And we would be exactly the same way if we go to Vegas or somewhere else. It doesn't matter where the tourist is coming from or where they're going to. The idea of tourism is you don't have to follow rules because you're paying to escape reality, and reality is when you follow rules. But it has to be different. The classic image I use, which is the one I got on here, would be, if you want to feed mainland tourists, you've got a luau or something like that, or even a hotel buffet. And so you want to have stuff that looks, here the stuff would have to be sort of Hawaiian. So what you're going to have is you're going to have some stuff. And, if you put lomi salmon out there, some folks will eat it, and most folks are sort of like, oh, that's sort of weird. You see the same relationship the mainland had until maybe 10 years ago with things like sushi, for example. So what you find here, though, is on the other hand, because tourists want something that's different, but they don't want it to be actually exotic. They don't want it to be really weird. So, for example, if you had a luau and you were serving, say Chinese dishes from Hong Kong, one of the things that you would serve would be, well, I suppose you wouldn't do it, but in Hong Kong, what's popular is blood jello, which my wife loves. I'm not that much of a fan of it. But you know, if you serve that to a group of mainland American tourists, the buggers would like freak out and be like, "What the hell is that? Blood jello?" Yeah, and people run around in circles or something like that, or just poking it, to see if it bleeds on them or something. So what they want is they want something that reminds them that they don't get that at home, but they don't want to actually risk about eating something they consider weird. So if you think about it, the perfect thing that you do at a buffet here, if it's been a hotel or a buffet, is you do teriyaki chicken with pineapple. You know, everyone knows what chicken is. They all eat chicken. They eat KFC or Popeyes or whatever the hell they eat normally. So they're familiar with chicken. They might even be familiar with teriyaki, but the, you know, the flavored teriyaki sauce here, depending on what you use, is a little bit different. Okay, that makes it a little different. And what you do is you put fresh pineapple slices on it. Now, there's nothing about that that a mainland tourist is going to like poke their finger and go like, "What is that?" But on the other hand, it's not the same way they get it at home. So it's the perfect combination of the familiar chicken and the exotic, which is the combination of the teriyaki and then the pineapple on that. Now, mind you, the teriyaki sauce, of course, originally from Asia in various forms. And the pineapple actually now comes from Central America. Now, we don't grow pineapple here commercially. So what they're actually getting isn't from Hawaii. And the dish, of course, is not Hawaiian at all. But because the pineapple didn't even show up till 1870s. But to the tourist, that's the exotic. But it has the advantage that it's not creepy exotic, it's just fun exotic. So tourism has an incredibly low threshold for real difference. And this is why invariably when people here say, "Oh, you know, you've got to educate the tourist," you know, if you're an anthropologist or geographer, you just go like, "That ain't gonna happen. I don't care what you do, you're not gonna educate tourists. Any more than you can educate us if you send us to the mainland and someone decides they're gonna go to a reservation. They're just gonna see Indians like they see in the movies." You can't educate tourists because people aren't being tourists to be educated. People are being tourists to escape reality. And the last part of reality they want to deal with is education. The other part of tourism that's really key, and let's switch over here. Sorry, I had the wrong thing. The wrong thing is what I want to fish up. This was the first tourist destination. Modern tourism starts in the 1830s, 1840s with a place called Brighton, England. Brighton's on the, you know, it must be on the East Coast, of England. It's near London. And what you had was in England at the time, they were just trying to come up with choo-choo trains. And they were desperately trying to find someone to get people to, somehow to get people to ride the trains. And the problem is they were too expensive for commercial use. You know, if you're going to use it to get to work every day, it's going to cost you a fortune. So they realized that what they had to do is they had to give people some reason to get on the train and go somewhere. And the problem is, what would somewhere be? And so what they came up with is very clever. The guys that owned the railroads actually bought this, you know, basically bankrupt little fishing community in the East Coast of England and made it into what you might call the original version of what Disneyland eventually gets set up. So they make all these absolutely fantastic, you know, unreal fantasy looks. And in that process, build a fantasy world that then draws people from London and the other urban centers, but specifically London, to go and spend the weekend in Brighton. Now, I didn't realize I was doing this for the geography class. There's actually a Brighton. Now, in the 1870s, they named it part of Coney Island's Brighton. So there's about 5 or 6 Brightons around the world, and they were all named after this tourist destination. So Brighton, England is the first tourist destination in the world in the sense of modern tourism, because it was designed specifically for tourists. They've got other places like, say, Rome or Paris or something like that were just, you know, major urban centers that people went to, and tourism grows in those. But until recently, they weren't really intended as tourist destinations. In fact, there's been some pushback on that. Brighton only existed because of tourism. So what you see here is one of the original I think it's from the 1870s or something like that. And this was the type of fantasy architecture that the place was famous for. Because if you're, you know, part of the lower middle class in London, you're going to go escape for a weekend, it has to be exotic and different. Now, you want everywhere here to speak English, and you want the food to be pretty typical, but you want the place to look like nothing you see at home. And this is the first successful tourist destination in the entire planet. And it's based on this idea of the different. Now, the weird thing about this is Brighton originally was advertised for its beach. And if you look at this bugger, this isn't exactly what we would consider a beach. This is rocks. Rock beaches are actually the norm in England. So what you had to do is you had to attract people to a place that really wasn't that super attractive in terms of the water's cold as hell. The beaches are all rock, so you pretty much have to wear shoes or be pretty tough, and it's pretty crowded. But this place was the first successful destination on the planet, and every other tourist destination since then. In fact, when you think about it, if you look at this, with the exception of the Ferris wheel, this is Waikiki. A lot of your places, Cozumel, et cetera, globally, to Phuket in Thailand, becomes successful and famous because of this. They keep the same triggers as Brighton originally built, first off, right out of the box in the mid-1800s, which is a beach, a place for people to hang out, see weird and different things, and do fun and different things. And in that process, escape the reality for a couple of days, or maybe a week if they've got money. And in doing so, this set the mantra because this place became enormously popular. And in doing so, this became the guidebook, or if you would, the list. If you want a tourist destination, bang, do it like that. And when you think about it, this is still tourism in 2020. It hasn't changed at all. It's now going on, yeah, it's over what, just about 100 years old. And, you know, the architecture's changed, but the idea of a fantasy and something different, that's still the same. Waikiki is just a, you know, 1980s, 1990s version of Brighton. And if you go to the other resorts, say the Wailea or the Kapalua or something like that, those are 1990s, 2000s versions of Brighton. And if you go to Mazatlan or Cozumel or someplace like that, those are, you know, whatever year they are, versions of Brighton. Brighton is the model. And because it was so enormously successful, and of course the train companies originally thought up the idea, made money like, you know, like crazy. It was like they could print their own money. And all of a sudden, everyone else on the planet, you know, as societies became successful, when you had a middle class with discretionary income, all of a sudden pop, the light goes off in their head, they're going like, damn, you know, we got to get a piece of that. And so that becomes tourism. Brighton is actually the basis for modern tourism. And it's sort of weird because it was, you know, it was intended to be very specifically for a train company that operated out of London that wanted to make money running people somewhere. So it originally had very small goals. You know, it was intended to be some sort of large global enterprise. One of the key parts, and again, remember that Arabian thing I showed you, that weird hotel, is that very early on, I don't know, I'm not really sure how these guys figured this out, you know, because there wasn't any, you have to remember when these guys sort of invented Brighton, they invented the whole tourism industry. It's amazing how right they got it. I assume they must have screwed up, but I've never actually seen a good, you know, at least an interesting, that I was willing to read, study of how Brighton came to be. But right off the bat, apparently what they realized is the folks that they wanted to take the train out to Brighton were generally lower middle class or middle class. And what those folks really wanted is, if you were going to escape has two parts. One is it's got to look different. Two, it's got to taste different. Think of the terry chicken with pineapple. But three, you have to be different. So since the tourist isn't going to change, what you have to do is you change the social status of the tourist. And in that way, you make it a different experience. So if you're a tourist and you go, let's flip back to that since it's a cute picture. If I'm a tourist and I'm gonna, you know, I'm booking a stay in this hotel. When I go in this hotel, remember they were doing this in the 1830s when this didn't exist yet. I go in there and people are going to treat me like I'm somebody of much higher socioeconomic status than I am. So they're going to be very polite to me. They're going to be very nice to you. And you have to remember, English society was and still is very class driven. So if you don't have a lot of money, people treat you, well, not like crap, but they treat you very politely but distantly. If you went here, they didn't treat you that way. And in here, when you paid for a room, they treated you like you were special. You went up to the front desk and they said hello, and some guy went and got your bags and did stuff. It's probably the only time in your life anyone had ever done that for you. So this became the biggest driving force for the tourism industry, is this part of the fantasy was that while you were a tourist, you were someone more special, socially, economically. You could pretend you were more wealthy. You could pretend you were more important. And the tourism experience gave that to you, which is probably one reason why it was so hugely addictive, because it hit on people's egos. And you can still see this in Waikiki. I noticed this morning when I was walking, or last week when I was walking to work, is I started to see a couple of rental Ferraris going around again. So what you get is middle-class types in Waikiki, and what they do, they rent a very expensive sports car they're never going to be able to afford normally. So for just a day or even a couple of hours, they can drive around, and people they don't know will be impressed, going like, wow, you own a Ferrari. You know, on one hand, everyone probably knows they don't, or well, assuming they care. But for a little while, you can pretend. if I was more wealthy, if I won the lottery or if whatever, I could own this car. If I won the lottery, if I had more money, I could live in a huge, weird mansion like this, and I'd have staff and butlers and servants who would take care of me. But for this, at least for a couple of days, I get that, because otherwise I'm never going to experience it in my life. So tourism gave that to people, and in some ways that was probably even more compelling than the escape visually, or the escape in terms of location, was the escape socially. That you could have the fantasy of being something you weren't socially for the time that you were a tourist. And this, of course, is why, and most of you haven't, or well, you have, but if you haven't, you will be. When you work in the tourism sector, it's always the classic mantra of retail, which is that customer is always right. And this is especially true in tourism. In tourism, the customer is always right, which is one reason why hotels are not going to get people's case if they don't wear a mask. That would be stupid for them. If they piss that tourist off, they're going to be on Yelp and a second complaint on their Instagram channel and pretty much trash the hotel because they ruined the tourist experience. Why? Because they asked them to do something. And if you're a tourist and you're wealthy, people don't ask you to do something. So tourism is pretending to be more than you are. It's like kids dressing up. And that's a huge part of tourism. And I would argue in many ways, at least from a social standpoint, is probably actually the most important. And that's one reason why it's temporary, because you can't afford to do that, because the general society is not going to accept you as fake for any more than a short period of time. So the tourism experience allows that bubble of being unique. And you can see that again with that Brighton, that weird hotel. Visibly, everything around you has to look and sound and smell different. And you get this in Waikiki. I haven't been down there, and I don't plan to be down there for a while. But I can guarantee if the tourist shops are starting to open up, you're going to get signs with those folks with those aroma things pushing out plumeria smells. Or you're going to get folks playing hapa music or something like that. All because that doesn't happen where they're from, say in like Des Moines, Iowa, or something like that. And you want to visibly have people walking down the street who, when they're walking down Kalakaua Avenue, are constantly being reminded it isn't Des Moines, Iowa. Because that reminds them in a very constant way they're not at home. And Brighton did that in an amazing way. And again, they just nailed the sucker, absolutely right first time out of the box. And sort of mind-blowing they did that. So everything has to be out of your normal experience, but it doesn't have to be stressful. And that's a real fine line to tag, which is why you find so many tourism industries fail. For example, extreme tourism. Extreme tourism for a while was very popular until people realized that people didn't want extreme tourist experiences. What they wanted was novelty experiences. So if you're, like friends of mine over Paia side, and you teach people to windsurf. So they're on the windsurfers. Well, that doesn't work very well. Why? Because everyone hoolies all over the place. It's too hard to do. So most people get upset. They don't want to do it. They'd much rather learn how to surf when they're on, like a 14-foot long, 8-foot wide, board, because then at least they can get on a wave and they can sort of scoot somewhere. They can say, I learned how to surf. Or, stand-up paddleboard, which isn't easy, but at least now the tourist ones are the size of an aircraft carrier. And that allows you to do something you don't do at home. And you've learned something new, but it didn't require a lot of effort or skill on your part. It was pretty straightforward. That's why ziplining was so popular 5 or 10 years ago. Now, as long as you were gullible enough to actually assume the guy that built it knew what he was doing, my dude, you got strapped on the thing, whole lot of time, you go down a wire and boom, you're someplace and you've done something different. It's a hell of a lot less risky and less stressful and less whatever than say, jumping out of an airplane. So tourism is really tricky because you want something that's different, but you don't want it to be highly stressful. You don't want it to be, emotionally stressful. And yet it has to be different enough from home that you don't normally think of doing it at home. And that's, if you think about it, that's a really fine line to walk in terms of what's going to work and not work in that situation. And that's why you see so many new things tried and fail here, and any place that does tourism. Tourism is frequently, in a weird way, on one hand, you don't want to spend any time actually having to learn stuff. But at the same time, what you want is actually to be given access to ways to improve yourself internally. It's especially true for Americans and Europeans. So people want to go someplace, but they want to experience something. Now, experience is great because if you experience something, you see this a lot if you interview tourists, like I did once during part of my dissertation, as you're interviewing tourists who are going up to Halakala to watch the sunrise. And I was trying for the life of me to figure out why the hell anyone would go to Halakala to watch the sunrise. I mean, it's cold as hell up there. And, and half the time it's got to be clouds. So why was it so important for them to do that? And their point was very simple, that it allows me to get a spiritual experience. But when you think about it, all I have to do is bundle up, get in a bus, and go up there and stand. It's not something I actually have to spend a lot of time learning. So it's not like learning Hawaiian or learning how to farm or learning how to fish with a spear or something like that. It's pretty passive, but they've got something out of it. Now it makes them a different person than it was before. And so, don't get this idea of intellectual growth as being tied to effort. What they want is painless intellectual or spiritual growth, which is why there's so many strange tourism industries here. Hanalei being a perfect example, or say Makawao and Maui. There's some pretty weird stuff that goes down there that is highly attractive to tourists because it's allowing them to get some sort of spiritual, intellectual growth for basically almost no effort other than being there and paying some money for something. Tourism is invariably both social and solitary. Tourists go to some place for themselves. They might go there as part of a group, but even then, themselves is a big part of it. On the other hand, one of the things that you'll notice with tourists is, and in many cases, are much more liable to talk to strangers than they would be in their normal home settings. And that's because everyone that's a tourist in a destination is seen as sort of sharing in that whole sort of vicarious escape. And the attitude is, of course, when you leave, that's now left behind. So you can interact or socialize with people you wouldn't normally because there's no consequences to that. It's going to be gone when you go home. So again, remember, this is where that bracketing of time is so critical. Inside of that bracket, you can act like an idiot or a fool or act in any way you want to because there's going to be no consequences. If you act like an idiot or a fool where you live normally, then people are going to remember that and your relatives and friends are going to go, what's your problem? If you do that as a tourist, no one knows who you are. And that's one reason why frequently in tourism you find people identify themselves with their first name, maybe where they're from in a vague way. Oh, I'm from New York, or I'm from Louisiana. If they're Fred from New York, they know there ain't no way you're ever going to figure out which Fred and how many other Freds are, which one that is to shoot. So it allows you the anonymity, it allows you the relaxation to pretend fantasy you're someone else, and also not have to follow social rules you don't want to that normally you have to. Again, this idea of escape. So it means that you're liable to interact and do things with strangers that you would not normally, especially if you're antisocial, simply because there's no consequences to it. There's no long-term impact to it. And of course, you're always in control. You're the tourist. The other part is something that causes a lot of problems in places like Hawaii, where you have limited resources, both food and especially water, is that tourism, by definition, part of this fantasy of wealth is that you don't have to worry about how much something costs. This is one reason why in tourism, and I don't care where it is, if you go to China, if you go to someplace in Japan, you'll see buffets are real typical in hotels. And in part, what that does, that allows the person who's, if they're visiting Xi'an or do some work, and they go to the hotel, invariably be like a breakfast lunch buffet. And what that allows that person to do while they're at the hotel is pretend they have so much money that they basically can have a cook lay out all these different types of food and they can just pick what they want out of it. And if you watch buffet eating, it's really sort of interesting. I kept on thinking at some point it'd be interesting to do a study how much food people put on plates they don't eat. But that's part of this idea that while they're pretending they're wealthy, there's no consequences to throwing food away. You're not going to get someone lecturing, well, there's starving people somewhere, and if you don't eat this food, then da-da-da-da-da. And the same way, tourists traditionally here in Hawaii take 2 or 3 showers a day. And the reason very simply is because they can. It's part of what they expect. And if you suddenly limited people to 1 shower a day, they'd be pissed. They wouldn't be at all happy with that, because part of the tourism fantasy of wealth and power is that people can't tell you no. They're not even supposed to tell you, please think about it first. That's why there was so much pushback if you remember when you were kids, we used to have a water on request rule from the Board of Water Supply. So if you were a tourist or anyone sitting in a restaurant, you had to ask for water because they were trying to cut back the water usage. It was the tourism industry that pushed back against that and basically said, tourists are really upset that you're asking them for water. And they don't think that's right. They're here as tourists and they should get as much water as they want, even if they don't drink it. And so basically that's why they dropped that. It was the impact. The argument from the tourism industry is the negative impact on tourists was more important than saving limited natural resource. And then there's nothing about that's unique to Hawaii. That's true every place. Vegas would be a perfect example of the same thing. So all of these things sort of are the criteria. I'm not going to bother going through this panel in depth. This is sort of a working list. I've been involved in tourism off and on probably almost 40 years in one way, shape, or form, usually studying it or doing work, analysis of it. And it's actually very straightforward. You know, there's the United Nations has a whole branch of the United Nations now that does nothing but tourism. And the reason is for many, especially quote developing countries, in other words, countries not so well off, you know, in production, something like that. Tourism is a way they've been able to escape the sort of, you know, low end loop that they were caught in vis-a-vis societies with more wealth and production base, etc. Tourism allowed a place that was generally not doing very well to suddenly become a successful location, and ironically, in some cases, by amplifying the don't doing well. So you could find rural areas and places would actually suddenly become successful because tourists wanted to go to some place that was an escape, and a rural area was a good example of that. So tourism, you know, has some criteria. The key ones is not so much what a tourist destination has to have, but what a tourism place has to avoid. And this is why tourism isn't successful in most of Micronesia. And this is why tourism has never been successful in Samoa, for example, which is at some point seems like it would be a logical tourism destination. At some point, you have to have a lot of different things for people to do. You know, some people are going to want to shop, some people are going to want to play, some people are going to, you know, whatever it is. You have to have variety so that everyone can be happy finding stuff without having to think about it. Because again, remember, tourism doesn't involve using your brain. So if you don't have a lot of different things for people to do, then that's going to work against you. Your distance is a factor, but it isn't necessarily a factor as long as you can, you know, create these other criteria to a large extent. So what you have to have is in having these will give you a chance to be a successful tourist destination. So if, for example, you're a small island in Micronesia, you can't do it. You don't have enough stuff that's different. It's too small. You might get a few tourists there that go there because of the isolation. But even then, they're going to look at you and think, oh man, I could be staying offshore of Phuket in Thailand on a cute little island. And that way I can get my little island at the same time I can get into a ferry, and in 20 minutes I'm in a big city having I can go party and drink and all this other stuff. On a little island, all I can do is sit. So you have to have all these varieties. And probably the key ones, you have to have a very, very complex infrastructure that's tourism based. Now, when I first started to do research in China, and one of the problems you got into is in a lot of China, even in the big cities, is, for example, the toilets were Chinese toilets, which are sort of hard to find now, though they're still around. They're completely gone from Japan, I think. And these are the classic squat toilets that you use in a lot of Asia. And, you know, on one hand, those work perfectly well as long as you know how to use them. On the other hand, you can imagine what happened when a tourist saw that, especially an American and European tourist. They're just like freaking out. They're like, what is this? There's no way I'm going to use that. And also in a lot of China, in fact, it's still sort of true today. Chinese don't have the same attitude towards a bathroom or a toilet. To them, it's just a device. So keeping it clean and making sure it doesn't smell and something like that is not really a big thing outside of the major cities where tourist destinations are. And again, the tourists get all offended. So it's not enough to have bathrooms. They have to be the right type of bathrooms. They have to be kept in the right type of way. They have to have the right type of stuff. You got to have the right type of water. You got to have the right type of electricity. I mean, all this stuff has to be, and it has to be in a form that tourists will accept because it's typical what they got at home. So if you got a tourist that's coming from California and they're used to 4G Wi-Fi connections and all the rest of it, you know, nice clean bathrooms, all that stuff. If you're trying to get them to go to Guam, then you've got to provide 4G, you've got to provide the same bathroom connections, all the rest of the stuff, because they're going to want the same stuff they have at home. They're not going to accept any less. Because being a tourist means that you don't have to compromise. Now they want Guam beaches and they want Guam, whatever they think the Chamorro lifestyle is or whatever it is, they want that too. That's the exotic part. But they don't want to give up the comforts of home. So juggling that is what makes tourist destinations work, and it's also what makes a lot of tourist destinations fail. There's a lot of places that have tried tourism and it's gone absolutely tanked on them. And when you look at them, it's sort of like, well, you know, they're saying, well, you know, they should be able to, this is the water we drink. It's like, dude, I don't care what water you drink. It makes tourists sick. Or they think it's going to make them sick. Or they think it tastes funny or it looks brown or whatever it might be. So they just aren't going to do it. So they won't show up. And you have to have things like a cheap labor pool. You have to have a lot of people willing to work for very low wages. This, of course, Hawaii is a perfect example of that. Tourists want to spend money to be someplace, but they don't want to spend a lot of money because it's discretionary income. But they want the same type of services that they would get with a lot of money. So if you're someplace like that exotic, you know, Arabian hotel in Brighton, you don't survive on charging one person a lot of money for 5 months. You survive by charging each person a significant amount of money for 2 or 3 days, but you then replace them every day with a new person. So you can either charge one person a lot, or you can charge a lot of people a lot less and then do it by volume. And so tourism is probably the first, outside of mass production, was the other first volume industry that probably existed globally. And that's tourism today. Tourism is based on numbers. You know, the state right now is talking here about when will we get back to 11.5, or really what they were really talking was 12 million tourists, which is what we were supposed to have in 2020 without COVID. And if you think about it, 12 million tourists in a place that has less than 1 million people on Oahu is pretty surreal. And that was tourism. And that's tourism. It's a volume industry. So we'll stop there, but this is all sort of, you know, food for thought, because we are one of the sort of iconic images of tourism is Hawaii. And so the world that you live in is the world that in many ways can almost be like the poster child for what is tourism. And also, as we'll see, is also the consequences of tourism.